I'm going to share with you 10 things that Muslims do not tell you while they're trying to get you to join Islam. And even after you join Islam, you may not even know what I'm getting ready to share you, but let's go ahead and get into it. So for the first thing we're going to talk about is Islam's Great Commission. Now, I say this because the Great Commission in Christianity is whenever Jesus gives our final marching orders to go and to make disciples of all nations. Well, in the same way, Allah or Muhammad gives the Muslims marching orders as well as to what they're supposed to do. And we're going to look at it. We're going to start with Sahih Bukhari 4364, narrated Al-Bara. The last surah which was revealed in full was Bara, or Surah Tuba, which is Surah 9, and the last surah, i.e. part of surah, which was revealed was the last verses of Surah Al-Nasi. They ask you for a legal decision. Say Allah directs thus about those who have no descendants or ascendants as heirs. So the important thing is, like I said, that chapter 9 of the Quran is the final marching orders that Muhammad and Allah give their followers. And it also happens to be the most violent of the chapters of the Quran, which is not a coincidence whenever we see all kinds of Muslims performing bombings and attacks and everything around the world. It's no coincidence that they are just so violent because this is what they're left with. We're to look at Surah chapter 9, verse 5. This is known as the verse of the sword. It says, "And when the inviolable months have passed, then kill the polytheists wherever you find them, and capture them, and besiege them, and sit and wait for them at every place of ambush. But if they should repent, establish prayer, and give zakat, let them go on their way. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful." So it's quite clear that the Muslims are supposed to attack the polytheist, and they're only to withhold their hands whenever the whenever the polytheist becomes Muslims, because it's quite clear when they pay zakat, that would be the Muslim equivalent of the money that they're supposed to give, and that's not to be confused with what the Jews and Christians pay, which is the jizya, which I will get to later in the video. Let's continue on. You can see in Surah chapter 9, verse 14, it says, "Fight them, Allah will punish them by your hands, and will disgrace them and give you victory over them, and satisfy the breasts of the believing people." So here we can quite clearly see once again that Allah is telling the people to fight the unbelievers, but it's also interesting that Allah says that He will punish them by the hands of the Muslims, which is why the Muslims perpetrate many terrorist activities around the world. And it's also important for us to see that Allah is incapable of acting on His own, of course, because He's not real. Because it's quite clear that Allah has to use the Muslims because He has no real power in and of Himself. Let's continue on. We can look at chapter 9, verse 19. It says, "Have you made the providing of water for the pilgrim and the maintenance of al-Masjid al-Haram equal to the deeds of one who believes in Allah and the last day and strives in the cause of Allah? They are not equal in the sight of Allah, and Allah does not guide the wrongdoing." So it's quite important for us to understand what the cause of Allah is. The cause of Allah is the waging of the lesser jihad, which is the one where they actually go out and fight jihad battles in order to slay the unbelievers. Let's continue on. We can look at 9:20. It says, "The ones who have believed, immigrated, and striven in the cause of Allah." Once again, it's the idea of the fighting, the external fighting, not to be confused with the greater jihad, which is supposed to be the internal struggle. But the point is, it's quite clear that they're talking about the external fighting against the unbelievers. And it says, "They have striven in the cause of Allah with their wealth and with their lives, are greater in rank in the sight of Allah, and it is those who are the attainers of success." So it's quite clear once again here that even so that Allah has favorites. Not everybody within Islam is treated equally or seen as equally valuable in the eyes of the God of Islam. We can look at Sahih Bukhari 2785, narrated Abu Hurairah. A man came to Allah's messenger and said, "Instruct me as to such a deed as equals jihad in reward." He replied, I do not find such a deed. Then he added, "Can you, while the Muslim fighter is in the battlefield, enter your mosque to perform prayers without cease and fast and never break your fast?" The man said, "But who can do that?" Abu Huraira added, "The Muslim fighter is rewarded even for the footsteps of his horse while it wanders about for grazing tied to a rope." So it's quite clear that the greatest thing that a Muslim can do, according to the hadith here, is to fight in the way of Allah and to wage external jihad, which is to reign by terror and spread Islam by its sword. Let's continue on. We can see quite clearly with regards to Ibn Kathir's commentary on 9:23. He says, Allah commands the shunning of the disbelievers, even if they are one's parents or children, and prohibits the taking of them as supporters if they choose disbelief instead of faith. So it's quite clear that Islam does have a culture of shunning disbelievers, to not be friends with disbelievers, to completely disregard them, and to consider them as infidels. We can look at Surah chapter 9, verse 29. It says, "Fight against those who do not believe in Allah." So it's quite clear that they're supposed to fight disbelievers on the basis of their faith. And let's continue on. "Or the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what Allah and His Messenger have made unlawful." So once again, here we can clearly see that Allah and Muhammad are put on the same level, which would once again show that Muhammad is committing shirk by using his imaginary friend Allah to elevate his own status. But let's continue on. It says, "Have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth, i.e. Islam, from those who were given the scriptures, which are the Jews and Christians. Fight until they give the jizya," which is the protection money, so that Muslims won't come and kill the Jews and Christians. Because in Islam, it's either you convert to Islam or you die. It's that plain and simple, because the Jews and Christians are allowed to pay jizya, which is the tax to basically not be killed, because they're paying protection money. Islam is a lot like the mafia, where the Muslims extort the Jews and Christians by paying protection money. Therefore, the Muslims do not kill the Jews and Christians, but those who are not Jews and Christians, according to Islam, are already dead. Let's continue on. We can look at Sahih Muslim 1730a. It says, "The permissibility of raiding the kuffar," which are the unbelievers, "who have been reached with the call of Islam without giving prior warning." Ibn Onan reported, "I wrote to Nafi inquiring from him whether it was necessary to extend to the disbelievers an invitation to accept Islam before meeting them in fight. He wrote in reply to me that it was necessary. In the early days of Islam, the Messenger of Allah made a raid upon Buna Malik while they were unaware and their cattle were having a drink at the water. He killed those who fought and imprisoned others. On that very day, he captured Jula bint al-Harith. Nafi said that this tradition was related to him by Abdullah bin Umar, who himself was among the raiding troops." So it's quite clear here that Islam is a religion of war, and it's also quite clear here that Muhammad is, he raided people and he stole their goods to use to increase his own power. But once again, it's quite clear that Islam has no love for anybody else outside of Islam, because in Islam you have the house of Islam and the house of war, and the house of war is anything not under the Islamic control. Let's continue on. We can see in chapter 9, verse 41, it says, "Go forth wherever lightly or heavy, and strive with your wealth and your lives in the cause of Allah. That is better for you if you only know." Once again, it's highlighting, and we're seeing this over and over in this chapter, the cause of Allah, which is once again the lesser jihad, to wage war against the infidels. Obviously, the theme is quite clear that the Muslims are a people of war and conquest. We can see another hadith here by Umar said, "We went out with God's messenger on an expedition, and when a man came upon a cave containing some water and vegetables, he felt inclined to stay in it and withdrew from the world. So he asked God's messenger permission regarding that. But he replied, I was not commissioned with Judaism or Christianity, but with the easy Hasif religion, by him in whose hand Muhammad's soul is, a morning or an evening expedition, which is the in God's path, which is once again the idea of the Muslim fighting a war of attrition against the infidel, is better than the world and what it contains, and for one of you to remain in the line of battle is better than his prayers for 60 years. So he's saying here it's better to wage war than to spend time in prayer to your God. So it's quite clear that Muhammad did not care about praying to Allah, worshiping Allah. He only cared about battle. And we know this to be the case because it says that it says in there, it says, one of you to remain in the line of battle is better than his prayers for 60 years. That is incredible to me, that Muhammad is so war hungry that he would not see prayer as a supremely important aspect of Islam. Now, I know you're going to say it's the 5 daily prayers and all of that, but the point is that it's quite clear from this hadith, and by the way, it's Sahih, so I don't need nobody trying to dispute that, but it's important for us to understand that he relegates prayer to an afterthought, that prayer, can be disregarded as long as you're in the front lines waging war against the infidel. We can see in chapter 9, verse 73, it says, O prophet, fight against the disbelievers and the hypocrites, and be harsh upon them, and their refuge is hell, and wretched is the destination. We can see Ibn Abbas's tafsir, which is a commentary on Surah chapter 9, verse 73. He says, O prophet, strive against the disbelievers with the sword, and the hypocrites with words. Be harsh, be tough with them, with both parties, with words and actions. Their ultimate abode is hell. Their destiny is hell. A hapless journey to the end they shall come to. So it's quite clear once again that the companions of Muhammad clearly identified the need for the sword. Islam has defined itself as the religion of war. Let's look at chapter 9, verse 111. This is important because we're going to see that the God of Islam, Muhammad, does not actually know what is in the Jewish or Christian scriptures. So we can see it says, Indeed, Allah has purchased from the believers their lives and their properties. In exchange for that, they will have paradise. They fight in the cause of Allah, once again, the jihad, so that they kill and are killed. It is a true promise binding upon him in the Torah and the Gospel and the Quran, and who is truer to his covenant than Allah. So rejoice in your transaction which you have contracted, and it is that which is the great attainment. So he's saying here that it's in the Torah and the Gospel so that they would kill and be killed. That's the promise. Now, the interesting thing is, and like I said, the God of the Quran, Muhammad, does not actually know what's in the Torah and the Gospel, because there is never a command to kill or be killed in the way of God in the Quran, which once again shows that Muhammad had no idea what in the world was in the Bible. Let's continue on. We can look at the second thing that the Muslim community hides from potential converts, or reverts as they like to claim, is that it denies Jesus' death by crucifixion. We can look at Surah chapter 4, verse 157. It says, And for their saying, Indeed, we have killed the Messiah, Jesus the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, and they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but another was made to resemble him to them. And indeed, those who differ over it are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it except the following of an assumption, and they did not kill him for certain. So it's important for us to see here that Islam holds to a substitutionary theory. Now they're going to say that somebody else was on the cross, but the interesting thing is here that they made the dumbest possible decision they could with regards to denying the single most detested fact of the life of Jesus being his death by crucifixion. And yet Muhammad is stupid enough to deny this fact. Let's just look at some of the evidence. We can of course look at the earliest writings on the life of Jesus would be the Gospels. We can see in Matthew chapter 27 verse 32 to 38. It says, as they were going out, they found a Cyrene man named Simon. They forced him to carry his cross. When they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, they gave him wine mixed with gall to drink. But when he tasted it, he refused to drink it. After crucifying him, they divided his clothing by casting lots. Then they sat down and were guarding him there. Above his head, they put up the charge against him in writing, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. The two criminals were crucified with him, one on the right and the other on the left. We can look at the Gospel of Mark 15:20 through 22. It says, after they had mocked him and stripped him of his purple robe, they put on clothes on him. They led him out and crucified him. They forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry his cross. He was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. So it's quite clear once again that both Gospels there are saying that Jesus was crucified. Let's continue on. The Gospel of Luke 23:32 to 34 says, two other criminals were also led away to be executed with him. When they arrived at the place called the skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they're doing. And they divided up their clothing and cast lots. I'm going to stop right here and once again note that Luke says that Jesus was crucified next to two criminals. And it's also important for us to understand that Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. This is important because our Muslim friends love to claim that Jesus was a Muslim. But the problem is, if you look in chapter 19, verse 88 through 93, it says that it's an atrocious thing to attribute a son to Allah, that the world basically tears apart at the mere mention of that, and that nobody can come to Allah except as a slave. But the point is here, once again, that the God of Islam denies being a father in any sense. He's not a father in a physical sense. He's not a father in a metaphorical sense, because he says elsewhere in the Quran, how can I have a son when I have no mate? Because it's quite clear that Muhammad did not understand any other way to take father except for physical, because it says that he had no mate. So therefore, since Allah had no mate, he could not have a son. So it's once again quite clear that Jesus is not a Muslim, and Muhammad doesn't realize that you can actually have father in a spiritual or metaphorical sense, without meaning a physical sexual relationship. Let's continue on. We can look at the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 16 through 18. It says, then he handed him over to be crucified. Then they took Jesus away, carrying the cross by himself. He went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him and two others with him, one on either side, with Jesus in the middle. So it's quite clear the earliest records on the life of Jesus, the Gospels, all unanimously indicate that he died by crucifixion, and yet the Quran foolishly denies this central fact of history. Let's continue on. We can look at the extra biblical information with regards to outside of the Bible on what the historians are saying. Josephus says in his Jewish Antiquities in Book 18, Chapter 3, Paragraph 3, he says, now there was about this time Jesus a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He withdrew over to them both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men, among us had condemned him to the cross. They that loved him at the time did not forsake him, reappear to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct from this day. So it's quite clear that Josephus does affirm that Jesus died under Pontius Pilate by means of crucifixion. Let's continue on. We can look at Tacitus, the Roman historian. He says, such indeed were the provocations of human wisdom. The next thing was to seek means of propitiating the gods, and the records were added to the sublime books, by the discretion of which prayers were offered to Valcanus, Sirius, and Papina. Juno, too, was entreated by the matrons in the capital, then on the nearest part of the coast, whence water was procured, sprinkle the fane and image of the goddess, and there were sacred banquets and nightly vigils celebrated by the married women. But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods, that the conflagration was a result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, this is speaking of the burning of Rome, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition. The subject for the moment again broke out only in Judea first, the source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all heinous and shameful for every part of the world find their center and become popular. So it's quite clear, once again, that Tacitus is saying that Jesus died during the reign of Tiberius under the command of Pontius Pilate, that he died the most exquisite death, which would be the cross, and that, of course, Nero once again is blaming the Christians for that. But the point is, once again, we have a Jewish historian and a Roman historian indicating that Jesus died by crucifixion. I could provide many, many more examples of historical attestation that Jesus died under Pontius Pilate by the way of crucifixion. So once again, we can see that the God of the Quran doesn't actually know anything about history, because he was dumb enough to be willing to deny the central fact of the life of Jesus, primarily his death by crucifixion. But I want to also make mention here that he also mentions the superstition that sprang up as well. And that would be speaking of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. But let's continue on and see what we find next. We can see that our third topic is Allah's love has limits. And this is quite profound, considering that Jews and Christians are supposed to have the same God as the Muslims, when that's actually not the case. We can see in Surah chapter 3, verse 30 and 31, it says, the day every soul will find what it has done of good present before it, and what it has done of evil, it will wish that between itself and the evil was a great distance, and Allah warns you of himself, and Allah is kind to his servants. So Allah is only kind to his servants, and that indicates us here that once again Allah has favoritism, which means that he's not the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible does not show favoritism to anybody. But let's continue on to verse 31. It says, say, O Muhammad, if you should love Allah, then follow me, so Allah will love you and forgive you of your sins, and Allah is forgiving and merciful. Did you notice that? You have to love Allah first before he will love you and forgive you of your sins. This is contrary to what we find in the Bible, where God first showed his love towards us, where Christ died for us even though we were still sinners. So once again, this is another indication that the God of the Bible is not the same God of the Quran. Let's continue on. We can see in verse 32 it says, say, obey Allah and his messenger, but if you turn away, then indeed Allah does not love the disbelievers. And notice it says down here in the English, it says like. But in the Arabic there, I made the square for you guys. You can clearly see the word is love. So Allah's love has limits. He only loves those who love him. He only loves those who follow Islam. So God's love does not extend to unbelievers. Let's continue on. We can see in Sahih Muslim 2167a, it says the prohibition of initiating the greeting with the people of the book, those are Jews and Christians, and how to respond to them. Abu Hurairah reported the Allah's messenger as saying, "Do not greet the Jews and Christians before they greet you, and when you meet any one of them on the road, force him to go to the narrow part." So here it's saying that you cannot greet a Jew or a Christian first. They must greet you first, and then you must push them to the side of the worst part of the road, the narrowest part of the road. So here, once again, we can clearly see that Islam has a superiority complex, and it tries to bully its way into having others, to be scared of Islam. But there's really nothing to be scared of in Islam, because all they do is yell and scream, and they choose violence because their arguments are not. They can't stand on the merits of their arguments, because their arguments are actual trash, and so that's why they have to choose violence, because the Muslim arguments, if you sit there and think about them for 5 minutes, there's no actual depth to them. But let's continue on. We can see the fourth thing that Islam hides is its view of Jews and Christians. They don't tell you this stuff when you're at the Dawah tent. They try to give you a whitewashed view of Islam, so they'll get you in there. They will sucker you into believing what they're telling you. But Islam doesn't also want to tell you that most converts to Islam leave within 5 years. But like I said, we're going to look at the view of Islam that it has of the Jews and Christians. It says in chapter 5, verse 51, it says, "O you who have believed, do not take the Jews and the Christians as allies," or other translation have friends or protectors. "They are in fact allies of one another, and whoever is an ally to them among you, then indeed he is the one of them. Indeed, Allah guides not the wrongdoing." So here, according to the Quran, the Muslims are not supposed to have Jews and Christians as friends, because the Jews and Christians are friends already. So Muslims, if you have friends that are Jews and Christians, you're going against the Quran. But once again, this is apparent that Allah has favorites, because the Quran says that the Muslims are the best of people. But let's continue on. We can see in chapter 98, verse 6, this is a classic text of Allah being an absolutely horrendous God who shows favoritism. It says in chapter 98, verse 6, "Indeed, they who disbelieved among the people of the scriptures, Jews and Christians, and the polytheists, will be in the fire of hell, abiding eternally therein. Those are the worst of creatures." The worst of creatures. This is amazing, because there's even the jinn, but yet the Jews and Christians who disbelieve in Islam are considered the worst of creatures. And this is also profound, considering that Satan is a created being in Islam too, but yet Satan ranks above the Jews and Christians, and we can clearly see that Allah has no love for the disbelievers. We can see the fifth thing that they hide, or they don't actually want to tell you about, is the scientific miracles in the Quran. Now, they'll tell you that they have scientific miracles in the Quran, but what they won't tell you is that their arguments have been debunked, and we have Muslims admitting that, and we also have Muslims admitting that the scientific miracles is an incoherent position. This is Hamza Swartza. He's the one that runs Hamza's Den. And this is what he says about the scientific miracles in the Quran. He says, "This essay has argued the scientific miracles in the Quran narrative is incoherent." So he's saying it doesn't make any sense, that it's been debunked. And this is quite clear if we, of course, even look at what popular Muslim preachers like Ali Dawah have said with regards to him claiming that the Islamic miracles argument has been debunked. So, like I said, go ahead and read Hamza's article, and you're going to come to understand that, like he said, that the Islamic miracle claim is incoherent. Let's continue on. The sixth thing they're going to not tell you when you get into Islam, or when they're trying to get you into Islam, is Islam's view of women, and it is atrocious. This is Surah 282. It says, "O you who have believed, when you contract a debt for a specified term, write it down, and let a scribe write it between you in justice. Let no scribe refuse to write it, as Allah has taught him, so let him write, and let the one who has the obligation dictate, and let him fear his Lord, and do not leave anything out of it. But if the one who has the obligation is of limited understanding, or weak, or unable to dictate himself, then let his guardian dictate in justice, and bring to witness 2 witnesses from among your men. And if there are not 2 men available, then a man and 2 women from those whom you have accepted as witnesses, so that if one of them errs," speaking of the women, "errs or messes up, then the other one can remind her." That's amazing. So Allah is saying, if one woman screws this up, go ahead and bring another one, so that woman can remind her of what's going on, because apparently, according to Allah, she's not smart enough to track with what's going on. This is an insult to women's intelligence, and the God of Islam does not care, and the Prophet of Islam is going to make this much worse with regards to his denigration of women. We can see in Sahih Bukhari 304, narrated Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. Once Allah's messenger went out to the Musla to offer the prayer of Ida al-Farhi prayer. Then he passed by the women and said, "O women, give alms, as I have seen that the majority of the dwellers of hellfire were you women." They asked, "Why is it so, O Allah's messenger?" He replied, "You curse frequently and are ungrateful to your husbands. I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you." So it's quite clear that Muhammad thinks they are not very smart, and they are deficient in mind and in religion. Let's continue on. It says, "A cautious, sensible man could be led astray by some of you." The woman asked, "O Allah's messenger, what is deficient in our intelligence and religion?" He said, "Is it not the evidence of 2 women equal to the witness of 1 man?" He's speaking of the last surah that we saw, 282. And it says, they replied in the affirmative. So here we have the women apparently agreeing with Muhammad that women are, according to Islam, stupid, which is not actually the case. There is no measurable difference of intelligence between men and women. But it says, they replied in the affirmative. He said, "This is the deficiency in her intelligence. Isn't that true, that a woman can neither pray nor fast during her menses," which is her time of the month? The woman replied in the affirmative. He said, "This is the deficiency in her religion." This is the dumbest thing I've ever read. And I've read this several times, and yet this is still the dumbest thing I've ever read. It is a degradation on women that Muhammad does not think they are intelligent whenever they are. And yet Muhammad wants to degrade them at every possible turn because he has a problem with women. We can see in Sahih Bukhari 7099, it says, narrated Abu Barka, "During the battle of Al-Jurun, Allah benefited me with a word I heard from the Prophet. When the Prophet heard the news that the people of Persia had made the daughter of Kusa their queen, the ruler, he said, 'Never will succeed such a nation as makes a woman their ruler.'" So he's saying that women cannot rule a nation and it be successful. So what about Queen Elizabeth II of England? She ruled for several decades and it was successful. So the Queen of England proved that Muhammad was not very smart, which is hilarious considering that Muhammad just got done saying that women are not intelligent. Well, apparently she's intelligent enough to run the country for several decades, Muhammad. This is another L for you, and you should take it on the chin, buddy. We should see in Surah 4, verse 3, that Islam promotes polygamy. You can see it says, "And if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry those who please you of the other women, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be able to marry only one or those your right hand possesses, i.e., slaves. No, those are not just slaves; those are sex slaves. They can do whatever they want with. So once again, we can see Islam trying to scuffle things into the text that's not there to try to soften what the actual Arabic says. It says that is more subtle that you may not incline to injustice. So we can clearly see here that Islam allows for polygamy, and it also allows you to have sex slaves. You can see in 424 it says, and also prohibited to you are, of course you can see the brackets there, so that's not actually in the text, married women except those who your right hand possess. So it's saying if a woman is married, you cannot have her unless she's a sex slave. Let's continue on. It says, the decree of law upon you and lawful to you are all beyond these that you seek them in marriage with gifts from your property, desiring chastity, not unlawful sexual intercourse. So for whatever you enjoy of marriage from them, give them their due compensation as an obligation, that there is no blame upon you for what you mutually agree to beyond the obligation. Indeed, the law is the ever knowing and wise. So we're going to look at the actual historical background of this verse. Once again, it's the idea of being able to have sex with married women whom you actually just killed their husbands. And we're going to look at the historical background now. It says in Sahih Bukhari 2542, narrated Ibn Musaf, I saw Abu Sa'id and asked him about cordus interruptus, which is where a man is having intercourse and he pulls out before he climaxes, if you will, or ejaculates. And it says, Abu Sa'id said, we went with Allah's apostle in Gaza of Bani al-Mujrik, and we captured some of the Arabs as captives, and the long separation from our wives was pressing. So they're saying they cannot stop their sexual desire because they've not been with their wives for so long. And it says was pressing up hard, and we wanted to practice cordus interruptus. Once again, that's where you pull out before you finish the job, basically. We asked Allah's messenger whether it was permissible. He said, it is better that you do not do that. So he's saying go ahead and rape the women. And it says, no soul that which Allah has destined to exist upon the day of resurrection will definitely come into existence. This is horrendous and terrible. And yet this is okay in Islam's most trusted sources. It's quite honestly despicable, and it should be condemned worldwide for the heinous act that it is. Because honestly, Islam as an ideology is a cancer on the world. You know, I do not hate Muslims, but I despise vehemently Islamic theology because the garbage it has caused for the world to have to endure and the pain and suffering that it has left in its wake. We can see in 434, the classic verse of beating your wife. It says, men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend for the maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devotedly obedient, guarding in their husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance or disobedience, notice it's only fearing arrogance or disobedience. It's not the fact that you can prove it, but yet if you just fear it, it says first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed. That's step 2, and finally strike them or beat them. So you're saying it's a 3-step process. And the last step, if the woman just won't listen to you, according to Islam, is to beat her. And we can see quite clearly in this next hadith, that is exactly what the Muslim men have done, is they have beat their wives mercilessly to the point of horrendous abuse. And we're going to look at it. We can see in Sahih Bukhari 5825, narrated Rifa divorced his wife, whereupon Abu Rahman bin al-Zarib al-Qurazi married her. Aisha said, that the women came wearing a green veil and complained to her, Aisha, of her husband, and showed her a green spot on her skin caused by a beating. So the man beat his wife so bad that he made her skin turn green when it bruised. And she says, let's see, she says causing the beating. It was the habit of the ladies to support each other. So when Allah's messenger came, Aisha said, I have not seen any woman suffering as much as the believing women. Look, her skin is greener than the clothes. So it's quite clear that Muslims are taking the 434 verse seriously, and they're beating their wives to the point of where their skin turns green. If you continue to read this hadith, Muhammad does not condemn the man for beating his wife at all. But yet, it, Muslims want to claim that they are the best husbands to their wives when they're indeed not. Even according to Aisha, that the Muslim men are beating their wives to the point where their skin turns green. So, a very childish man, a very immature man puts his hands on a woman, and yet Muslims do it over and over and over, and they think it's fine because their prophet did the same thing to Aisha, that he hit her in the chest as well. And yet, even here, we can see that Muhammad did not condemn the man for beating his wife. So Muslims think that it's okay to beat your wife. I'm saying no, it's not okay to beat your wife. You should cherish her. You should love her. You should be willing to sacrifice yourself for her. You're not supposed to beat her like a freaking drum. You're supposed to love for her and care for her, not abuse her. We can see the seventh thing that Islam hides from potential reverts is its view of children. We can see in chapter 65 of the Quran, this is the chapter on divorce, what the Islam thinks of children. And it says in chapter 65:4, it says, and those of your women as have passed the age of monthly courses for their iddah, the waiting period. Now, the waiting period is important because the waiting period only applies to women whom you think are pregnant, so who you have had sexual intercourse with or who you have touched, because there's another place in the Quran where there is no waiting period because you have not touched the woman. So it's quite clear here that sex has happened, and the waiting period to see if the woman is pregnant is 3 months. But let's continue on. It says, and if you have doubts about their periods, it is 3 months. And for those who have no courses, i.e., they are still immature or prepubescent or children, the iddah prescribed period is 3 months. Likewise, except in the case of death, and for those who are pregnant, whether they are divorced or their husbands are dead, their iddah prescribed period is until they lay down their burden, and whosoever fears Allah and keeps his duty to him, he will make his matter easy for him. Now we're going to look at what the Muslim commentators say on this verse with regards to having sex with children, because that is indeed what this text is saying. It says in Ibn Abbas's commentary on this verse, he says, and for such of your women as despair of menstruation because of old age, if you doubt about their waiting period, shall be 3 months. Upon which another man asked, O Messenger of Allah, what about the waiting period of those who do not have menstruation because they are too young, which means they are children, they are prepubescent, along with those who have it not because of young age, their waiting period is 3 months. Another man asked, what is the waiting period for those women who are pregnant and for those with children, i.e., those who are pregnant, their waiting period shall be until they lay down their burden, their children, and whoever keepeth the duty to Allah, and whoever fears Allah regarding what he commands him, he maketh his course easy for him, he makes his matter easy. And it is also said, this means he will help him to worship him well. We can also see that Jalalain says on this verse, and as for those of your women who read in both instances no longer expect to menstruate, if you have any doubts about their waiting period, their prescribed waiting period, shall be 3 months. And also for those who have not yet menstruated because of their young age, their period shall also be 3 months. So it's once again saying that if you have sex with a child, that you have to wait 3 months to make sure she's not pregnant. Do you know what we call that? We call that pedophilia. Islamic men are pedophiles, apparently, if they want to do this, because it is allowed in Islam to do this. And how do we know it's allowed in Islam to do this? Because even in hadiths, it says that Muhammad wrote the marriage contract with Aisha when she was 6 and consummated the marriage with her when she was 9. So Muhammad had sex with a child, and therefore Muhammad is a pedophile. Now, I realize Muslims, you're not going to let me calling your prophet a pedophile, but if the shoe fits, that's definitely what he is. And the shoe does fit, even according to the DSM-5, the one on psychological disorders. He fits the definition of a pedophile to a T. I invite you to go up there, go into the DSM-5 and look it up. He fits this criteria perfectly. Let's continue on. We're going to look at the 8th thing that the Muslims hide from you, that Muhammad orders torture and murder. We're going to see in the life of Muhammad on page 550 that Muhammad orders the torture of a man to find a treasure. It says, Kenan bin al-Rabi, who had the custody of the treasure of bin al-Nadir, was brought to the apostle, who asked him about it. He denied that he knew where it was. If you come to the apostle and said that he had seen Kenan going around a certain ruin every morning early, when the apostle said to Kenan, "Do you know that if we find you have it, I shall kill you?" He said, "Yes." The apostle gave orders that the ruin be excavated and some of the treasure was found. When he asked him about the rest, he refused to produce it. So the apostle gave orders to al-Zurb bin al-Ami to torture him until you extract what he has. So he kindled a fire with flint and steel on his chest until he was nearly dead. Then the apostle delivered him to Muhammad bin Muslim and struck off his head and for vengeance for his brother. So it's quite clear here that Muhammad ordered the torture of a man just to find a treasure. It's quite clear that Muhammad was a very greedy individual. We can also see, though, like I said, that Muhammad ordered the murder or assassination of his critics as well. We can see in the life of Muhammad on page 675, it says, Abu Ayyub was one of Ben Umayyad's clan. He showed his dissatisfaction when the apostle killed Al-Rahman bin Suwaid bin Amitz and said, "Long have I lived, but never have I seen an assembly or a collection of people more faithful to their undertaking and their allies when called upon, the sons of Quetta. When they assembled, made to overthrow mountains and never submitted. A writer who comes to them split them into, saying, permitted, forbidden, all sorts of things. Had you believed in the glory of the kingship, you would have followed Tuba." The apostle said, "Who will deal with this rascal for me?" Whereupon Salim bin Umar went forth and killed him. So it's quite clear that Muhammad ordered the assassination of this man. We can also see that he ordered the assassination of a woman poet as well. It says, when the apostle, this is on page 676 of the life of Muhammad, when the apostle heard what she had said, he said, "Who will rid me of Marwan's daughter?" Umar bin al-Khattab, who was with him, heard him, and that very night he went to her house and killed her. In the morning he came to the apostle and told him what he had done, and said, "You have helped God and his apostle." Did you notice that? You have helped God and his apostle. How so? You helped him by eliminating one of his critics, which once again shows the weakness of the God of Islam, that the God of Islam was not able to do this on his own. But it also shows the frailty of Muhammad, that he's not willing to be able to take criticism. He's not willing to turn the other cheek. He's not willing to, to overlook an offense. No, he has to retaliate, and he retaliates by ordering the murder of his critics. We can also see the ninth thing they hide from you is that he had a revelation from Satan. And this is very damning for Islam. This again is in the life of Muhammad. It says, now the apostle was anxious for the welfare of his people, the Quraysh, wishing to attract them as far as he could. It has been mentioned that he longed for a way to attract them, and the method he adopted is what Ibn Hamid told him that Salim said he had told him as well. And it says that when the apostles saw that his people turned their backs on him, and he was pained by their estrangement from what he brought them from God, he longed that they should come to him from God, a message that would reconcile his people to him. Because of his love for his people and his anxiety over them, it would delight him if the obstacle that made his task so difficult would be removed, so that he meditated on the project and longed for it, and it was dear to him. Then God sent down by the star when it sets, your comrade errs not, and is not deceived. He speaks not from his own desire. And when he reached his words, have you thought of Elat and El-Usa and Manat, the third, the other? Satan, when he was meditating upon it and desiring to bring a reconciliation to his people, put upon his tongue, these are the exalted flying cranes, whose intercession is approved. So here we can clearly see that Muhammad gave revelation from Satan. It says, when the Quraysh heard that, they were delighted and greatly pleased at the way in which he had spoken of their gods, and he listened to them while the believers were holding what their prophet brought from their Lord was true, not suspecting a mistake or a vain desire or slip. And when they reached the prostration in the end of the surah, in which he prostrated himself, the Muslims prostrated themselves when their prophet prostrated, confirming what he had brought and obeying his command. And the polytheists of the Quraysh and others who were in the mosque prostrated when they heard the mention of their gods. So everyone in the mosque, believer and unbeliever, prostrated except al-Mirf, who was an old man who could not do so. So he took a handful of dirt from the valley and bent over. Then the people dispersed, and the Quraysh went out delighted at what had been said about their gods, saying, Muhammad has spoken of our gods in splendid fashion. He alleged in what he read that they are the exalted flying cranes whose intercession is approved. It continues on. It says, the news reached the prophet's companions who were in Albania, it being reported that the Quraysh had accepted Islam, so some men started to return while others remained behind. Then Gabriel came to the apostle and said, what have you done, Muhammad? You have read to these people something I did not bring to you from God. You have said what he did not say to you. The apostle was bitterly grieved and was greatly in fear of God. So God sent down a revelation, for he was merciful to him, comforting him and making light of the affair. Did you notice that? God is making light of the affair that Muhammad gave a revelation from Satan. It's quite clear that the God of Islam does not actually care about his word very much. But he goes on, he says, making light of the affair and telling him that every prophet and apostle before him desired as he desired and wanted what he wanted, and Satan interjected something into his desires as had on his tongue. So he's saying that every prophet and apostle has satanic influences in their lives with regards to divine words or divine revelation. So he's trying to make Muhammad feel better and say, Muhammad, you're not the only guy that this has happened to. But as a matter of fact, it is Muhammad, because the prophets in the Old Testament, they did not dare to give a revelation from Satan because they would be killed. Let's continue on. It says, then God sent down, we have not sent a prophet or apostle before you, but when he longed, Satan cast suggestions into his longing, but God will annul what Satan has suggested. Then God will establish his verses, God being knowing and wise. Thus God relieved his prophet's grief and made him feel safe from his fears, and annulled what Satan has suggested in the words used above about their gods by his revelation. Are you the males and his the females? That you were indeed the unfair division, the most unjust. They are nothing but names which your fathers gave them as far as words to whom he pleases and accepts. How can the intercession of their gods avail with him? We can continue on. We can see it says, when the annulment of what Satan had put on the prophet's tongue came from God, the Quraysh said, Muhammad has repented of what he had said about the position of your gods with Allah, altered it, and brought something new. Now those two words which Satan had put upon the prophet's tongue, or the apostle's tongue, were in the mouth of every polytheist, and they became more violent, hostile to the Muslims and the apostles' followers. Meanwhile, those of his companions who had left Albanius, when they heard that the people of Mecca had accepted Islam, when they prostrated themselves with the apostle, heard when they approached Mecca that the report was false, and none came into the town without the promise of protection or secretly. So here we can clearly see that Muhammad gives a revelation from Satan, and then God says it's not a big deal, Muhammad, that God's making light of the situation, and God's saying that it happens to everybody, Muhammad, don't worry about it, don't sweat it, I'll take care of it. So once again, we can clearly see that the God of Islam actually does not care about his revelation being kept pure. Let's continue on. And this is important because Muslims are going to throw a fit and say this is not authentic. Well, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, Muslims, you really need to read your scholars on this. We can see what a Muslim scholar, Shabib Ahmed, says in Before Orthodoxy, the Satanic Verses in Early Islam on page 2 and 3. He says, the Satanic Verses incident is the name given in Western scholarship to what is known in the Islamic tradition as the story of the cranes or the story of the maidens, which narrates the occasion on which the Prophet Muhammad is reported to have mistaken words suggested to him by Satan as being divine communication, that is, of being part of the Quran. These satanic verses praise the pagan deities of the prophet's tribe and acknowledge their power to intercede with the supreme God. By uttering the satanic verses, Muhammad thus committed the error of compromising the fundamental theological principle of the divine message of which the messenger, namely the absolute and exclusive unicality of the one God, Allah. This study of the satanic verses incident in the historical memory of the early Muslim community will demonstrate in detail that the incident constituted that absolutely standard element in the memory of early Muslims on the life of their prophet. In other words, the early Muslims, as the overwhelming majority of the Muslim community in the first 200 years was concerned, the messenger of God did indeed on at least one occasion mistake words of satanic suggestion as being of divine inspiration. For the early Muslims, the satanic verses incident was something entirely thinkable. We can see the last thing that the Muslims hide from you is the importance of Muhammad's death. We can see in chapter 69, verse 44, it says, and if he, Muhammad, had made up about us some false sayings, we would have seized him by his right hand. Then we would have cut off his aorta. So it's saying if Muhammad gave a false prophecy or something false about Allah, that God would seize him by his right hand and cut off his aorta. This is very important, so keep that in mind. We can see in Sahih Bukhari 26:17, narrated Anas bin Malik, a Jewess brought a poisoned cooked sheep for the Prophet, who ate it She was brought to the prophet and was asked, "Shall we kill her?" He responded, "No." I continued to see the effect of the poison on the palate of the mouth of Allah's messenger. So the point here is that this Jewish woman, she cooks a meal for Muhammad. Now, mind you, this is a Kaibar, and Muhammad just slaughtered this woman's entire family. And Muhammad's dumb enough to take a meal from a woman whose family he just killed. Nobody else except for the Prophet of Islam would be dumb enough to take a meal from a woman whose family you just killed. But yet Muhammad just shows his stupidity. Let's continue on. We can see it says in Sahih Bukhari 4428, the sickness of the Prophet and his death. Narrated Aisha, this is the child bride, the one that he married at 6 and raped her at 9. This is what she says. The Prophet, in his ailment in which he died, used to say, "Oh, Aisha, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Kaibar, and at this time I feel as if my aorta is being cut from the poison." So it's quite clear that Muhammad identifies himself as a false prophet because he says that he feels his aorta being cut, which is exactly the same way that God said he would kill Muhammad if he was a false prophet. So these are just 10 facts that Islam hides from potential reverts because they don't want you to know these facts because of how embarrassing they are. And if you keep digging, you're going to find more terrible things about Islam and about Muhammad. I will see you in the next video.